In the cultural memory of America, the very name Folsom Prison evokes a strange mix of fear, myth, and music. Thanks to Johnny Cash's legendary 1968 performance, delivered inside the prison's dining hall before hundreds of inmates, the penitentiary is immortalized in popular imagination. But beneath the fame of that concert lies a much darker, more complicated story. It is a story not just of punishment and confinement, but of daily survival, where something as ordinary as food became a symbol of power, dignity, and occasionally defiance. When Cash sang "I Shot a Man in Reno Just to Watch Him Die," the audience of convicts erupted in laughter and cheers. But earlier generations of inmates at Folsom weren't being serenaded by outlaw country stars. They were being served meals that told a story of deprivation, control, and, at times, surprising attempts at humanity. One artifact from that era offers a rare glimpse into the world behind those prison walls. A menu from 1925, listing the daily meals served to the incarcerated men. On that brittle sheet of paper, now circulating on social media, lies an odd detail that captures attentional: curry with rice. The dish stands out not only because curry was a rarity in mainstream American dining of the time, but because it challenges the stereotype of prison meals as nothing more than gruel and bread. That curiosity is what drives us into this investigation. What exactly did it mean to eat like a prisoner at Folsom in the 1920s? And more broadly, what do prison meals reveal about the political, economic, and social realities of America during that period? The historical record, though fragmented, gives us some answers. Prison cooks in the 1920s often relied on military manuals for their recipes. These standardized government-issued cookbooks were originally designed to feed battalions of soldiers cheaply and efficiently. The 1916 Manual for Army Cooks offered one such recipe: beef curry, scaled for 60 men. Its instructions were brutally simple. Dice 20 pounds of beef. Seasoned with curry powder, cook in broth, thicken with flour, and serve hot. It was nutrition stripped down to bare essentials, a reflection of the institution's philosophy itself. Function over taste, sustenance over satisfaction. By cross-referencing commissary reports from 1933, we learn that Folsom's version of lamb curry likely included onions and carrots, alongside rice, beans, and the ubiquitous white bread. Chicory, coffee bitter, diluted, and far removed from the artisanal brews of today, was the daily drink. For many prisoners, that was the highlight of the day. A steaming tin cup of harsh, black liquid, more fuel than comfort. But behind this seemingly mundane list of ingredients lies a larger truth. Food inside a prison is never just food. It is a tool of control, a marker of privilege, and sometimes a catalyst for unrest. The distribution of meals at Folsom was layered into hierarchies. Prisoners who cooperated, informed, or simply behaved could ascend to better tables with richer meals, while troublemakers were left with beans, watery, skilly, or, in the most extreme cases, bread and water rations in solitary confinement. In other words, food was currency. It determined your survival, your health, and even your status in the brutal microcosm of prison society. At the same time, Folsom's prison farm and orchards became an economic engine. By the 1880s, acres of potatoes, corn, onions, and fruit trees supplied not only inmates, but also contributed to California's booming agricultural trade. This dual function, feeding prisoners while reducing state expenses, was touted by wardens as proof of prison efficiency. Yet, beneath those official reports lay another reality: overcrowding, malnutrition, and constant tension. Consider the paradox. In 1889, a local newspaper celebrated the prison's 4th of July festivities, noting that prisoners drank lemonade, possibly chilled with ice from the hydroelectric-powered facilities nearby. It painted a picture of civility, even festivity. Yet, just decades later, eyewitness accounts describe the dungeon cells. Pitch black, bare save for a blanket and a bucket of lime. Prisoners on punishment diets bolted beans without chewing, their hunger so overwhelming it destroyed their stomachs. The contrast between the official narrative and lived experience could not be starker. And this is where the geopolitical and economic lens adds depth to the story. Folsom was more than a prison. It was a reflection of America's industrial age anxieties. Built in 1882, relieve overcrowding at San Quentin, Folsom was designed at a time when California was rapidly expanding, its rivers dammed for power, its valleys turned into breadbaskets, its cities swelling with new labor forces. The prisons symbolized both progress and repression. Hydroelectric power made it the first U.S. prison with electricity. But the men inside its iron doors lived in medieval conditions, locked in 4-by-8-foot cells without plumbing or heat. Even the seemingly exotic lamb curry fits this pattern. By the 1920s, America was experiencing a wave of immigration that reshaped its food culture. Curry powder, often a British colonial import, entered kitchens through military manuals and global trade. Its appearance on a prison menu suggests not culinary diversity, but bureaucratic standardization. Prisoners weren't being offered a taste of India. They were being fed the cheapest available protein, flavored with whatever bulk spice blend procurement officers could obtain in quantity. Still, there is a humanizing detail here. However bland, however institutional, curry was a dish with warmth, color, and spice. For men trapped in a world of iron doors and silence, a spoonful of lamb curry might have carried some fleeting memory of the outside world, or at least a break from monotony. That small details, the hint of ginger, the yellow hue of turmeric cream, reminds us that even in the harshest systems of control, there are traces of humanity. And yet, food could just as easily ignite chaos. Holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas offered moments of abundance: fresh roast pork, apple pie, and even baseball games on the yard. But in 1927, a Thanksgiving meal coincided with a deadly riot, forcing guards to mount machine guns in the dining hall. The very space where meals were meant to maintain order became the flashpoint of rebellion. This dual role of food pacifier and powder kegs, a theme that runs throughout the prison's history. As we begin this journey through Folsom's past, from menus to riots, from Johnny Cash to the anonymous men who bolted beans in the dark, one thing is clear: the story of prison food is the story of power. What was served on the plate was never random. It was a reflection of economic priorities, political decisions, and human struggles that went far beyond the prison walls. In the next part, we will dive deeper into the early years of Folsom, its architecture, its labor system, and its infamous lack of walls that allowed 13 men to escape in 1903. But before we move forward, let's pause here and remember that the taste of lamb curry in 1925, bland or not, was more than just a meal. It was a chapter in the struggle between control and survival, between punishment and dignity, that continues to define prisons to this day. Folsom Prison did not emerge out of nowhere. Its very existence was born from a problem plaguing California in the mid-19th century: overcrowding at San Quentin. By the late 1860s, San Quentin's walls were bursting, its cells jammed with men from the gold rush era and the rapidly expanding frontier state. Lawmakers sought a solution, and the land along the American River, 45 miles northeast of Sacramento, was chosen as the site for a new penitentiary. Construction began in 1868, but, as with many public works of the era, funding delays, political wrangling, and corruption slowed progress. It would take 12 years before the first 44 prisoners were transferred to the new facility. On July 26, 1880, from the outset, Folsom was a paradox. On one hand, it was envisioned as a modern prisoner, symbol of California's ability to manage its growing population and demonstrate law and order. On the other, it was built in a manner that reflected the brutal, penal philosophies of its age. In those early years, the prison had no heating and no plumbing. Inmates were locked inside solid iron cells, each only 4 by 8 feet, with minimal light and ventilation. These suffocating cells were not just instruments of punishment. They were calculated mechanisms of control. Darkness, confinement, and silence were as much a part of the sentence as the years assigned by the judge. What made Folsom unique, however, was its original lack of a surrounding wall. Unlike other penitentiaries that relied on massive stone fortifications to contain inmates, Folsom was instead guarded by armed watchtowers. For decades, this absence of a wall made escape both a temptation and, occasionally, a reality. The most infamous early breakout occurred in 1903, when 13 inmates armed themselves after seizing weapons from the armory. Their escape was possible precisely because there were no external barriers. Though many were later recaptured, 5 disappeared forever into history. This vulnerability underscored the contradictions of the prison system. Authorities boasted of modernity, yet operated an institution where basic security infrastructure was absent. Newspapers of the time, both local and national, seized on the sensational escapes. They reported with a mixture of outrage and fascination, fueling the growing mythos of Folsom as a place simultaneously feared, mocked, and dramatized. Calls for a proper wall mounted in the years after 1903, but, astonishingly, it would take 2 full decades before construction was completed in 1923. For 20 years, the state gambled on human vigilance over concrete barriers, a gamble that cost lives and undermined public trust. This period also exposed a deeper truth about American prisons. They were as much about labor as they were about punishment. Inmates were not simply warehoused. They were put to work. Folsom's location along the American River was deliberate. The nearby hydroelectric dam, powered by inmate labor, made Folsom the first prison in the United States to generate and use electricity. This technological achievement was trumpeted as proof of progress. Yet behind the headlines was a darker reality. Men in chains, performing back-breaking work under armed supervision, producing not only electricity but also lumber, stone, and agricultural goods that fueled California's economy. This use of prison labor reflected a larger economic pattern sweeping across America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As the country industrialized, prisons became reservoirs of cheap, controlled manpower. In California, this was especially valuable. The Central Valley's booming agriculture demanded ice, and Folsom's hydroelectric power allowed large quantities to be manufactured year-round. Local farmers depended on this supply to keep fruit fresh for shipment across the nation. Thus, while prisoners themselves were denied luxuries, even a chilled drink, except perhaps on holidays, the very system of their confinement made cold lemonade on a hot July afternoon possible for free men outside. The irony was not lost on the convicts, though their voices were seldom recorded. Accounts from the era paint stark contrasts. On July 4, 1889, The Folsom Telegraph described inmates celebrating Independence Day with music, speeches, and a large batch of lemonade. The article framed the event as proof of humane treatment and civilized order within the prison. Yet, just a few years later, testimony from prisoners themselves spoke of dark dungeons 13. Pitch-black, solitary cells where men were fed little more than bread, water, and occasionally beans. One inmate in 1926 described bolting down his bean ration so quickly, out of sheer hunger, that it caused stomach troubles. Another spent an unimaginable 18 months in near-total darkness. These stories strip away the rosy veneer of official reports, exposing instead a regime of harsh control, where food and light themselves became tools of discipline. Here again, the role of food surfaces as central. Official records described expansive prison gardens, 10 acres planted with potatoes, onions, corn, tomatoes, and cabbage. Annual reports boasted that the prison was self-sufficient, raising pigs, curing bacon, producing hay, and even cultivating orchards and grapes. Warden Charles All, in his 1889 report, bragged that such efforts reduced costs and improved prisoner health. But beneath these statistics lurked a deeper strategy. By controlling not just the inmates but their very sustenance, the prison reinforced its power. Food was both a necessity and a weapon. To those who obeyed, there were vegetables, meat, and even occasional fruits. To those who resisted, there was skilly watery gruel, made from oats and salt pork or worse, bread and water in solitary. The system extended into a stratified dining structure that would later be remembered as the first, second, and third tables. At the bottom, meals were bare, often beans served without utensils, forcing prisoners to eat with their hands from tin plates bolted to tables. Silence was mandatory. At higher tables, privileges expanded. Meat, vegetables, rolls, even coffee. At the third table, conversation was permitted. Meals resembled something closer to what guards themselves ate, and convicts could experience a fleeting illusion of dignity. But such privileges were not granted freely. They were earned through cooperation, obedience, or sometimes betrayal. Stool pigeons and informers, the snitches, were rewarded with steak and potatoes. Food was currency, and the prison wielded it with precision. In the broader context of American history, these practices mirrored societal tensions. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era were periods of enormous economic growth, but also deep inequality. Prisons reflected this duality. They were marketed as progressive, modern, efficient institutions, proof that the state could both punish and reform. But, for the men living inside, they were oppressive microcosms of exploitation, hierarchy, and control. The contrast between the public image of Folsom and the grim lived reality of its prisoners mirrored the broader contradictions of American capitalism itself. By the early 20th century, the need for reform was becoming increasingly apparent. Escapes, riots, and scandals, including the exposure of counterfeit coin production inside the prison in 1898, embarrassed officials and eroded public confidence. Yet, as we will see, instead of dismantling these systems, authorities doubled down. They strengthened walls, expanded farms, and refined food distribution as both an incentive and a punishment. In the next part, we will examine in detail the infamous dining hall system, how food became not just sustenance, but a mechanism of social engineering within the prison, shaping behavior, enforcing silence, and rewarding obedience. The story of the first, second, and third tables reveals as much about power and psychology as it does about the menu itself. When most people think of prisons, they imagine bars, guards, and punishment. Yet, inside Folsom, One of the most powerful tools of control was not the gun or the whip, it was the dinner table. The dining hall was more than a place to eat. It was a theater of order, silence, and hierarchy. 3 long rows of wooden tables filled the cavernous space, and each inmate knew exactly where he belonged. There were no choices. Placement was determined not by preference, but by rank within the prison's invisible caste system. At the first table, conditions were bleakest. Here sat the newcomers, the troublemakers, and the defiant. Meals were stripped down to the barest essentials: beans, bread, and water. The beans were served in tin plates that were bolted directly to the tables, making even the act of eating mechanical and degrading. Forks and knives were forbidden, sometimes even spoons. Prisoners had to scoop beans with their fingers, shoveling food into their mouths like animals. Conversation was strictly prohibited. Silence hung heavy, punctuated only by the scrape of tin cups or the shuffling of guards. It was at this level that punishment became most visible. A man seated here was marked a warning to others of what happened when you resisted authority. The second table offered slightly better conditions. Prisoners here were granted utensils and a wider menu. Meat, vegetables, and coffee appeared regularly. Alongside the ever-present beans, conversation, however, was still forbidden. Silence remained the rule. Yet, within that silence, men developed their own codes, glances, subtle hand movements, even rhythms tapped on tin cups. These silent communications were acts of resistance, proof that even in a system designed to strip individuality, the human spirit found ways to connect. Then came the third table, a place of relative privilege. Here, men were rewarded with meals closer to those of the guards themselves: steak, rolls, potatoes, even occasional desserts. Conversation was permitted. Laughter, jokes, and whispers carried through the hall, creating a stark contrast with the oppressive hush of the lower tables. To eat at the third table was to experience, however briefly, the illusion of normal life. But this came at a price. These seats were often reserved for the so-called good prisoners, the cooperative, the obedient, and above all, the informants. Those who gave information to guards about planned escapes, riots, or black market trades often found themselves suddenly promoted to the third table. Food, in other words, was not simply sustenance. It was a tool of social engineering. The psychology of this system cannot be overstated. By tying meals to behavior, prison authorities created a structure in which obedience was not just commanded but incentivized. Want coffee? Follow the rules. Want steak? Report your fellow inmates. Hunger and taste were converted into weapons of control. But while the official records and wardens' reports spoke of efficiency and order, the lived reality of this system was much darker. Former inmates later recalled the humiliation of eating beans with their hands, the gnawing jealousy of smelling steak at the next table while chewing stale bread, and the bitterness of watching informants enjoy luxuries denied to the rest. For many, the dining hall was not simply a place of nourishment, it was a daily reminder of powerlessness. And yet, food was also a rare point of rebellion. In 1927, a group of inmates refused to eat their rations, staging a hunger strike to protest conditions. Their refusal was dangerous. In a system where food was both punishment and reward, rejecting it outright was an act of defiance that shook the prison hierarchy. Though the strike was eventually broken, it revealed cracks in the institution's ability to control through hunger. We should also consider how all of this fits into the larger picture of American prisons at the time. Folsom's three-table system was not unique. Across the country, prisons experimented with similar methods: silent dining halls, food as privilege, hunger as punishment. But Folsom's notoriety, its repeated escapes, and its sensational press coverage made its practices more visible to the public. Reports of the dining hall's stratification fed into debates about whether prisons should focus on punishment or rehabilitation. Was the third table an attempt at reform? Or was it simply bribery coercion disguised as privilege? Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the United States was undergoing rapid change. The 1920s brought prohibition, organized crime, and the rise of new law enforcement institutions. As criminals became more organized, so too did the prison system. The wall, built in 1923, symbolized not only physical containment, but also a philosophical shift. America was moving toward harsher, more rigid incarceration. Folsom was no longer just a prison. It was a microcosm of the broader tensions between freedom, order, and control. By the 1930s, Folsom's reputation as a hard place was firmly cemented. It was spoken of in newspapers with both fear and fascination. Hollywood, too, began to circle around the mythology of the prison, romanticizing escapes and dramatizing its brutal environment. Food, silence, riots, and escape soul, these became ingredients in the legend of Folsom. But the story does not end there. For, as the 20th century marched forward, the prison would face new challenges, riots that shook its very foundations, executions that drew national attention, and, eventually, a music performance that would forever change its place in American culture. In the next section, we will step into the 1930s and 1940s, when rising tensions, overcrowding, and the Great Depression pushed Folsom to the brink, and when food again became central, this time as both a spark of rebellion and a desperate act of survival. The 1930s were a hard decade for America and for Folsom Prison. They were brutal. The Great Depression had emptied wallets across the country, and crime rates surged as desperate men turned to theft, robbery, and bootlegging just to survive. The result? California's prisons swelled far beyond capacity. Folsom, already infamous for its walls and silence, became dangerously overcrowded. Imagine a prison built to hold 1,800 men, suddenly crammed with nearly 3,000 inmates. Cells meant for one now housed two. Tension simmered in every corridor. The silence of the dining hall no longer felt like discipline, it felt like pressure building inside a boiler, waiting for the moment it would explode. And explode it did. The riot of 1933, in July 1933, food was once again the spark. Prisoners had long complained that their meals were both meager and rotting. Spoiled beans, moldy bread, rancid meat. That summer, the heat made the problem worse. When a group of inmates refused to eat, guards responded with force, dragging men from the dining hall and throwing them into solitary. Word spread quickly, and within days, the strike had grown into a full-scale riot. Prisoners overturned tables, smashed windows, and hurled trays like weapons. Guards stormed the hall with rifles and batons. The clash was brief but bloody. Several inmates were shot, and dozens were beaten unconscious. The rebellion was crushed, but the message was clear. Food was no longer just a tool of control, it had become a rallying cry for dignity. Executions as spectacle. At the same time, executions at Folsom cast a long, dark shadow. California still relied on the gallows, and between 1930 and 1937, the prison became known for its public hangings. Crowds gathered outside the prison gates on execution days. Newspapers printed lurid details, and the spectacle reinforced Folsom's reputation as a place of ultimate punishment. Inside the walls, executions sent shockwaves through the inmate population. To eat your breakfast in silence. knowing that a fellow prisoner was eating his last meal just down the hall was a chilling reminder of how fragile survival could be. The economy of hunger as the Depression dragged on. Scarcity reshaped prison life. Food became currency. Coffee, sugar, and metre in daily rations were traded like gold. Smuggled onions, hidden apples, and even crusts of bread became part of an underground economy. This black market trade wasn't just about hunger. It was about power. Gangs and strongmen controlled the flow of contraband food, building influence that rivaled the guards themselves. To eat better than your assigned ration was a privilege bought not with obedience, but with alliances and risk. Folsom in the 1940s, when World War II erupted, the prison entered another transformation. While young men across the country were drafted into battle, Folsom's population shifted. Many inmates now were older, seasoned criminals, or those convicted under strict wartime laws. Rationing hit the prison hard. Even steak at the third table disappeared, replaced with powdered eggs, canned meat, and bread stretched with filler. Yet paradoxically, the war also brought new opportunities. Prisoners were put to work making military supplies, uniforms, boots, and equipment. For the first time, some inmates felt a strange connection to the outside world. Their labor, though forced, contributed to the national war effort. Food rations for prisoners were sometimes improved, in line with wartime standards, though not equally distributed. Again, hierarchy ruled. Still, rebellion simmered. In 1944, another strike broke out. This time involving nearly 600 men who refused to leave their cells until conditions improved. Once again, food was central. Letters smuggled out of the prison described weevils in bread, spoiled beans, and portions so small that men were left constantly hungry. The strike was eventually broken, but it left behind a legacy of defiance. The shadow of control. By the end of the 1940s, Folsom had cemented its reputation as a paradox. It was a fortress of discipline, yet constantly plagued by rebellion. It was a place where silence ruled, yet where food spoke louder than words. Every riot, every hunger strike, every whispered trade of contraband bread revealed the same truth. Control could be enforced, but never complete. As the prison moved into the 1950s, a new era dawned. America was changing, prosperous, confident, and restless. But inside Folsom, the old struggles remained. And soon, a single performance in the prison's cafeteria would forever change how the world remembered this place. By the 1950s, America was booming. Suburbs were sprouting, televisions flickered in living rooms, and Elvis Presley's voice was shaking jukeboxes across the country. But inside Folsom Prison, life was anything but modern. The silence rule still loomed. The food was still grey, lifeless, and sparse. And the overcrowding problem was worse than ever. While California built new highways and shopping malls, it neglected its prisons, and Folsom groaned under the weight of too many men packed into too little space. A new kind of prisoner, the 1950s, also saw a shift in who filled Folsom's cells. Gone were the days when the majority of inmates were bank robbers or cattle rustlers. Now, a younger generation was entering, men tied to street gangs, drug crimes, and the rise of organized syndicates. These inmates brought with them a new culture of toughness, survival, and defiance. They were less likely to submit to old codes of silence. They laughed in the dining hall. They traded more openly. They pushed back against guards. In a strange way, the prison was beginning to reflect the rebellious spirit that was brewing in American culture outside its walls. Food as protest again. Throughout the 1950s, food remained a constant flashpoint. Inmates still complained of rancid beans, watery stew, and bread crawling with mold. Every so often, men would stage sit-down strikes, refusing to leave the dining hall until their demands were met. One report from 1956 described an incident where nearly 200 prisoners refused to eat, demanding better rations. Guards responded with clubs and tear gas. The strike collapsed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Food wasn't just fuel, it was freedom or the lack of it. Seeds of change. In the 1960s, by the early 1960s, America itself was restless. Civil rights protests, anti-war movements, and a growing counterculture were challenging authority everywhere. That spirit seeped into Folsom's walls. Prisoners began filing lawsuits, demanding recognition of their constitutional rights. Some argued that rotten food and brutal punishments amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. For the first time, courts began to listen. Folsom, once untouchable, was now under scrutiny. But nothing captured the world's attention quite like what happened in January 1968. Johnny Cash at Folsom. On January 13, 1968, country singer Johnny Cash walked into Folsom Prison's cafeteria, guitar in hand. His reputation was already tied to outlaw songs, and his voice carried the weight of rebellion, faith, and sorrow. Inmates packed the room, sitting shoulder to shoulder at the same tables where they had eaten spoiled beans and endured decades of silence. But this day was different. Cash sang not to silence them, but to give them a voice. "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," he said, and the room erupted in thunder. Cash's setlist was raw, unflinching. Songs about murder, despair, and the hopeless grind of prison life. He wasn't performing for the wardens or for the newspapers. He was performing for the men society had locked away and forgotten. And they loved him for it. The concert was recorded, pressed into vinyl, and released as Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison. The album was a sensation. It resurrected Cash's career, electrified the music world, and transformed Folsom from a fortress of silence into a cultural icon. For the first time in its history, the world didn't just see Folsom as a prison. They saw it as a stage. Beyond the music, but beneath the glory of Cash's concert, life for inmates didn't magically improve. The food was still poor, the overcrowding worse than ever, and tensions between guards and prisoners continued to erupt into violence. Yet the concert marked a turning point. Folsom was no longer just a closed world of punishment and silence. It had become part of the national conversation. The 1960s ended with Folsom's reputation forever changed. It was no longer simply the prison of silence, it was the prison of song, protest, and the sound of one man's guitar echoing against the stone walls. The 1970s were a storm for American prisons, and Folsom was right in the eye of it. Across the country, prisons were exploding in riots, lawsuits, and demands for reform. The old model of silent discipline had collapsed, but nothing stable had replaced it. At Folsom, the decades of overcrowding, bad food, and harsh punishments finally boiled over into full-scale rebellion. The Folsom Riot of 1970, on November 19, 1970, chaos erupted inside Folsom. The spark was small. Tensions between black and white inmates, stoked by overcrowding, gang politics, and frustration with conditions. But once the fight began, it spread like wildfire. Prisoners armed themselves with makeshift knives and clubs. They set fires, smashed windows, and battled guards in the yard. For nearly 4 hours, Folsom was out of control. By the time the smoke cleared, 1 guard and 2 inmates lay dead, and dozens were injured. This riot wasn't just about race. It was about power. It was about the hunger, the filth, the feeling that survival inside Folsom depended on violence. The riot shocked California and forced the public to face a hard truth. The prison system was on T, just broken it was dangerous. The rise of prison politics, the 1970s, also saw the rise of radical prison movements. Inspired by the civil rights struggle and groups like the Black Panthers, some inmates began to organize politically. At Folsom, a group of black prisoners wrote the Folsom Prisoners' Manifesto. In 1970, it was a blistering indictment of the system, demanding everything from better food and healthcare to freedom from racial segregation. The manifesto spread nationwide, becoming a symbol of prison resistance. For guards and officials, this was terrifying. Inmates weren't just rioting, they were organizing. And food, as always, remained a central demand. Food strikes in the 1980s. By the 1980s, America's war on drugs was filling prisons faster than ever. Folsom's population swelled to over 4,000 men, nearly double its capacity. Conditions spiraled. In 1986, a massive hunger strike shook the prison. Hundreds of inmates refused food for days, demanding an end to what they called nutritionally inadequate meals. Reports described portions so small that men were losing weight rapidly. With meat replaced by soy filler and bread stretched thin, the strike gained media attention, and California officials were forced to investigate. While some reforms followed slightly larger portions, new contracts for food suppliers, the core problems remained. The silence of the old days was gone, but the struggle over food had never ended. Violence in the 1990s, if the 1970s had been about rebellion, and the 1980s about protest, the 1990s were about survival. Gangs had taken over the prison economy. The Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, and other groups turned Folsom into a battlefield. Food became more than trade, it was protection. To eat safely in the dining hall, you needed the backing of your gang. The violence was relentless. Stabbings in the yard, attacks in the chow hall, ambushes in the corridors. Guards responded with heavier weaponry, riot squads, and lockdowns. The dining hall, once a place of silent meals, was now one of the most dangerous places in the prison. Sitting at the wrong table could mean death. Folsom on camera, but outside those walls, Folsom's reputation remained tied to Johnny Cash. Documentaries, TV specials, and films returned again and again to that 1968 concert, painting the prison as legendary, almost mythical. The reality of hunger, riots, and endless violence was far darker. By the end of the 1990s, Folsom had become a paradox. It was both an American icon and a humanitarian disaster. A place where history, music, rebellion, and survival all collided. The new millennium brought new promises and new failures for Folsom Prison. After more than a century of riots, hunger strikes, and relentless overcrowding, California claimed it was finally ready to modernize. But, as with so many chapters in Folsom's story, reality proved far more complicated. The 2000s, tough on crime meets a broken system. By the early 2000s, California's three strikes law had stuffed prisons to the breaking point. Men were serving life sentences for non-violent crimes, like stealing a slice of pizza or shoplifting a pair of socks. Folsom's population ballooned to nearly double its design capacity. Dorms built for 100 men now held 300. The dining hall, already infamous for bad food and violent clashes, became an impossible space. Thousands of inmates eating in shifts, under the watchful eyes of guards armed with rifles from gun rails above. Food was still a flashpoint. State contracts with private suppliers cut costs, but also cut quality. Inmates complained of mystery meat, soy-based substitutes, and expired products. One former prisoner later said, "You didn't eat to live, you ate to survive." Every meal was a gamble. Technology arrives behind bars by the mid-2000s. California invested in surveillance technology. Cameras were installed in chow halls, yards, and cell blocks. Metal detectors screened every movement. Even the kitchens saw new systems for inventory control, meant to stop theft of food that inmates often smuggled back to cells to trade like currency. But while technology made the prison easier to monitor, it didn't make it safer. Violence still erupted in the dining halls, often along racial and gang lines. Guards began using pepper spray and rubber bullets more frequently to break up fights. The dining room, once a silent hall of misery, was now a battleground under constant digital watch. The 2010s, federal intervention, California's prison crisis reached a boiling point in the 2010s. In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that California's overcrowded prisons, including Folsom, violated the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. At one point, the state's prisons were operating at 200% of capacity. The ruling forced California to release or transfer tens of thousands of inmates. At Folsom, this briefly eased pressure, but the underlying problems, violence, poor food, and crumbling infrastructure, meant hunger strikes returned in force. Inspired by protests at Pelican Bay, inmates at Folsom refused meals, demanding an end to indefinite solitary confinement, better healthcare, and edible food. Some strikers went weeks, consuming nothing but water and salt. Their message was clear. Even in the 21st century, food remained a weapon of control. Today, Folsom in the 2020s today, Folsom still operates, but it is no longer the same fortress of stone and silence that opened in 1880. Parts of the prison have been modernized, with new housing units and education programs. Rehabilitation is now part of the official mission, yet the old problems linger. Overcrowding still pushes the prison beyond safe limits. Violence remains a daily risk, and meals, according to former inmates, the menu still features watery beans, overcooked pasta, and portions so small that prisoners depend on canteen food, ramen, chips, and candy bars to survive. Ironically, Folsom is also now a tourist attraction. The Folsom Prison Museum welcomes visitors who come to see Johnny Cash memorabilia, old shackles, and photographs of escapes and riots. For the outside world, Folsom is history legendary, almost romantic. But for the men still inside, it's not legend. It's reality. A reality where food can spark a riot, silence can be a weapon, and the struggle for dignity never ends. The legacy of Folsom. From its opening in 1882 to today, Folsom Prison has been more than just a correctional facility. It has been a mirror of America itself. The hunger for control, the rebellion against injustice, the clash between silence and song. The dining hall alone tells the whole story. From the iron silence of the 1890s to the riots of the 1970s. To Johnny Cash's guitar echoing in 1968, to today's plastic trays of soy patties and watery beans, Folsom is not just a prison, it is a symbol. A place where silence, rebellion, and survival all sat down at the same table. Epilogue: the story of Folsom Prison is not just about stone walls and steel bars. It is a story about control, who holds it, who loses it, and what happens when people are pushed to the breaking point. When it opened in 1880, Folsom was meant to be a machine of silence and order. Men ate in silence, worked in silence, and slept in silence. Food was rationed like gunpowder. Never enough, never satisfying, always a reminder of who was in charge. But silence does not last forever. The riots of the 20th century, the hunger strikes, the endless overcrowding, all were cracks in the foundation. The dining hall, once a place of forced quiet, became a stage for rebellion. Every tray of beans, every stale slice of bread, every watery stew became a weapon in the battle between authority and survival. And then came Johnny Cash. With one concert, he transformed Folsom from a fortress of despair into a symbol. For the outside world, Folsom became legendary. For those inside, it remained a daily fight for dignity. What Folsom really represents Folsom is America in miniature. Its obsession with punishment, its failures of justice, its moments of rebellion, art, and humanity. Food at Folsom was never just food. It was control. It was resistance. It was survival. From the meager bread of the 19th century to the mystery meat of the 1980s, to the ramen packets traded like gold today. Every bite tells a story of power and struggle. The final image, if you walk into the Folsom Prison Museum today, you'll see Johnny Cash's guitar on the wall. You'll see photographs of riots, shackles worn smooth from use, and menus from the old chow hall. Tourists look, nod, maybe smile at the music that once echoed through those walls. But for the men still living inside, it's not history. It's their life. The silence may be gone, the food may have changed, but the fight for dignity, for survival, for a voice remains, and that is the true story of Folsom Prison. Not just a prison, not just a concert, but a century-long battle between silence and rebellion, hunger and hope.